Good evening, everyone. I am Brooke Clement, and as the director here at the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Library Museum, which is part of the National Archives and Records Administration, it is my pleasure to welcome you. Before we start tonight, can you please ensure that your cell phones are either turned off or on silent? While you're doing that, I would like to briefly highlight some of our upcoming events here at the Ford Museum. This Thursday, Richard Norton Smith and Hank Meyer will be on this stage to discuss President Ford at the Bicentennial and Lessons for America at 250. On March 11th, yes, so I hope you all come back for that. On March 11th, we are hosting Brian Becker, who will talk about his father's pivotal behind-the-scenes role in the lead up to the Nixon pardon. And on March 25th, we are going to be hosting Thomas DeFrank, the author of Write It When I'm Gone, as he discusses his experiences as a White House pool reporter during the Bicentennial. For more details on these and other programs, please visit our website at fordlibrarymuseum.gov. And now I'm going to turn it over to our terrific partner at the Ford Foundation, Gleaves Whitney.
So I'm so glad to see all of you. The weather's, perking up, and you're here, all alert and ready to go. You're going to learn a lot tonight from our speaker. I do want to give a shout out, though, to two wonderful partners in this room. Brooke, the partnership with you at the museum and library is one that we really treasure. President Ford wanted it to be that way. And if President Ford were here today, I know that he would also say the partnership with the World Affairs Council is absolutely essential to increasing all of our IQs about international relations. So we got a great thing going here. I'm so glad we can convene in a forum such as this. Real briefly, before I ask Dr. Kubik to come to the podium, I want to tell you about a little experience I had. I just learned a new word. Well, I can learn a lot of new words, but this one was particularly interesting to me. I was at a conference, and it was an AI panel, and a word was coined about 3 weeks ago that had not existed in the English language before. So you probably are already ahead of me on this, but it's called hyperstition. How many of you have heard of the word hyperstition? It's an AI word. And it's important with AI and the deep fakes that are out there because it's the idea behind hyperstition is it's a falsehood that is repeated so many times, like a quantum scale, and constantly moving through the culture that it becomes believed. A falsehood that becomes believed and is considered truth. And I just want to say, when I heard of this word, I am proud, and I know Brooke is, and I know Michael Van Denen and his crew are, and Joel and everybody else associated with this partnership. We are proud to be working in organizations that do not engage in hyperstition. Right? You're not going to see hyperstition in the museum exhibits. You're not going to see hyperstition over in the library where you have the archives that become the seedbed of great scholarship. You're not going to see hyperstition in our speaker series and our programs. You're going to get the truth. And you're going to get it in a way that I think is both convincing and open to dialogue, because all truth should be open to dialogue, right? So with that, the preliminary, I've done my little lesson for the day. I'd really like now to bring up, yes, Dr. Erica Kubik, and she will introduce our speaker tonight.
Here to dialogue and truth. What a great way to think about our programs for this evening. So as Gleaves introduced me, I'm Erica Kubik. I'm the Director of Programming for the Council, and I just want to introduce my colleagues, Michael Van Denen, Rachel Brooks, Abigail Stead, our wonderful volunteers, and our board of directors. They all make the work we do shine, and we're proud to bring our programming to the wonderful Ford Museum. We express our appreciation for our friends at the Ford, both at the museum and the foundation. And I also want to just say thank you to GRCC, who helps us with our recording. So if you find tonight's program useful, interesting, please help us by sharing this information. We put these out on our YouTube channel after the programs have finished. I also want to say thank you to the WGBU Public Media because they are our presenting media sponsor, and to the Community Media Center as our communication partner. And finally, I'd also like to thank this week the City of Holland for their topic sponsor of tonight's program. So now let me introduce our presenter for the evening. I'm very excited to have him join us on stage. For more than 20 years, Hardy Merriman has worked in the field of civil resistance, supporting movements advancing human rights, freedom, and justice worldwide throughout research, writing, workshops, and program leadership. He served as president of the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict, or the ICNC, from 2022 to 2025, after previously serving as its president and CEO. He's also been a senior technical advisor to USAID's Powered by the People program and a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, where he led the fostering of Fourth Democratic Wave project on foreign policy support for pro-democracy movements. Earlier in his career, he held multiple leadership roles at ICNC, worked with the Albert Einstein Institution, and served as an adjunct lecturer at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. His latest publication is Harnessing Our Power to End, HOPE, Political Violence, and that was in 2024. His presentation tonight is titled Fostering a Fourth Democratic Wave, Countering the Authoritarian Threat. Let's extend a warm welcome to Hardy Merriman.
Good evening. It's so good to be here. Apologies, I've had to raise the podium a little bit for those who came up before me. It's so good to be here. I want to thank Michael Van Denen. I want to thank Erica Kubik. I want to recognize the World Affairs Council of Western Michigan for inviting me, and also just for the deeply noble work that they do, engaging fellow Americans on global affairs. We need more of it, I think now more than ever. So really my respect and appreciation for that. And I also want to recognize the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Museum for hosting it, and all the sponsors of this event, and also all of you for coming out and choosing to spend an hour with this. So 2026 has been a year in which foreign affairs has already made front page news several times, including, of course, in the last few days. I think while recent developments might be front of mind for many of you, what I'm going to try to do today is take a step back and make a presentation that I hope will offer a helpful perspective on understanding where the world is today and a bit about how we got here, and most importantly, what we can do about it. And so I'm going to start by talking a bit about the bad news. I promise you there will be good news. I would not title this Fostering a Fourth Democratic Wave if I wasn't going to get there. But I think it's important that we look at where things stand right now clearly with open eyes so that we can react accordingly. So I'm going to talk about how the world is amidst a major autocratic wave, which has grown over the last 2 decades. That's where I'm going to start. This wave has been characterized by an increasing number of autocratic governments globally, as well as many democracies backsliding. And then during this wave, autocracies have also significantly increased their economic and military power, as well as their willingness to collaborate with each other. And so cumulatively, this is leading to a world that is much more dangerous and much more hostile to democracies than what we've seen in recent decades. So this is bad news, but again, I promise you this is not the end of it. Democracy and authoritarianism have advanced and receded historically in waves, and there's a lot we can learn by looking at what's come before this autocratic wave, which was called the Third Democratic Wave, which I will get to. But I want to start by just sort of defining 2 key terms: democracy and autocracy. Colloquially, of course, political leaders apply these terms to things that they like and things that they don't like, right? So for example, in the realm of domestic and international politics, various sides claim to be representing democracy and claim their opponents are authoritarian. or autocratic. And of course, their opponents may level the same accusations against them. And so at the level of political rhetoric, it can be confusing. And to be sure, some accusations have a lot of veracity, and others are really misplaced. But still, these terms start to lose their technical and analytical meaning when they're thrown around so much. And so for me, as an analyst, I think of these as technical terms. Every field has its own specialized terminology. Lawyers do, doctors do, electricians do. We should have more technical definitions when we talk about these terms because they're so important. So what makes a country a democracy or an autocracy? How do we analyze their political system? So what analysts tend to look at, for starters, to determine this is at least 5 measures. The first is the presence of free and fair elections. The second is the degree of universal suffrage and participation in those elections. The third is the strength of the rule of law in that country and the judiciary in upholding the rules freely and fairly and independently. The fourth is the protection and recognition of human rights in the population. And then the fifth is the presence of free and independent media. And I would argue that if you want to analyze whether a country is autocratic or democratic, you can't get there without at least, at a minimum, looking at those 5 factors. And you could certainly look at more, some people do. You could look at the degree of civilian control of the military. You could look at the robustness of civil society. You could look at the degree of separation between religion and state. And among these factors that I mentioned 8 of them, democracy is generally correlated with higher levels, and autocracy is generally correlated with lower levels. And so in this way, we can see that democracy and autocracy have multiple components and they exist on a spectrum. Some countries line up pretty clearly on the democracy side, some line up more on the autocracy side, and many have components that are somewhere in between. Some might have pretty good elections, but declining rule of law, or the opposite. It depends. So there is a range, and it's tricky to rank these factors for each country. Nations are complex. Every political system has its own particular challenges and circumstances. There are shades of gray. Analysts get into big debates over how to classify countries. There's different ranking systems. Like any field, you go further, and people have lots of opinions about how to think about this question, but I'm just laying out the general contours. And in general, regardless of the ranking system that you choose, they all are fairly similar. And in general, what they'll do is if a country meets a certain threshold, they'll put it in the democracy column. And if it's below a certain threshold, they'll put it in the autocracy column. And then there's subdivisions from there. Now, why am I telling you this? Why am I leading off with a bunch of technical sort of terms about this? Because part of what I want to do here is draw from research about democracy and autocracy. And I want to be clear how these terms are defined when they're researched. Because when we can understand and have a framework and a system for analyzing countries, we can do a bunch of things. We can track trends in that country over time. We can track trends globally about which way things are moving towards autocracy or democracy. And we can also start to compare autocratic and democratic governments as a whole to try to understand what kind of results those 2 different kinds of government lead to. We'll talk about each of these. So to start with, what is the state of democracy in the world today, now that we've defined it clearly? The short answer is not good. So the organization Freedom House ranks countries and territories, and they have done so since 1972, everyone in the world, every country and territory in the world, and they release a report every year. The new one's coming out, usually comes out around March, so it should actually come out this month, but it hasn't come out quite yet, so I'll quote last year's report. And so the report's called Freedom in the World, and in 2025, what they found is that the last 19 consecutive years have featured autocratic gains globally and democratic declines. Every single year for 19 years. No exceptions. As a result, much of the world's population has experienced a really massive shift of governance in just one generation. Freedom House finds that between 2005 to 2024, the percentage of global population living in democracies declined sharply from 46% in 2005 down to 20% in 2024. As a percentage of global populations living in democracy, it's a huge decline in 20 years. In contrast, the number of people living in, quote, partly free governments, under partly free governments, which have a mix of democratic and autocratic attributes, rose dramatically from 18% in 2005 to 42% in 2024. And meanwhile, the number of people living in full autocracies remained relatively stable, moving from 36% up to a little bit to 38%. But what these findings reveal is a really deeply troubling erosion of democratic rule. What's happening? Democracies are breaking down. This is a primary reason why the classification of government is shifting in terms of the percentages of people living under it. Democracies are breaking down into what we call hybrid regimes, which have this mix of autocratic and democratic traits, and some hybrid regimes are actually breaking down fully into authoritarianism or autocracy. Reflecting the magnitude of this shift, there's another outfit or another group called the Varieties of Democracy Project out of the University of Gothenburg in Sweden. They also do rankings. They're also very good, like Freedom House. They assessed last year that the average level of global democracy experienced by a citizen in the world is at the same level it was in 1985. So that's the loss of about 40 years of democratic gains we've seen in this autocratic wave. It's been severe. So a little bit more bad news, and then we'll pivot. The downward trend has actually accelerated in recent years. The first decade of the current autocratic wave, which was from 2006 to 2016, moved slowly. And I remember those days where people were saying, well, autocracy seems to be coming back. How bad is it? Is it real? Will democracies bounce back? So there's all this sort of debate about it in the first year as it moves slowly. But now it's pretty clear. The wave has quickened, and it's really showing no signs of slowing. Just to throw one other sort of set of numbers at you, in 2024, the Varieties of Democracy Project found that 42 countries around the world were trending towards becoming more autocratic, but only 18 were trending towards becoming more democratic. So one other thing about this is that I mentioned earlier how the number of people living in full autocracies hasn't changed that much. But the nature of those autocracies has. They've become more autocratic now than they were 20 years ago. China is more autocratic now than it was 20 years ago. Russia is more autocratic than it was 20 years ago. And they've also become more coordinated and more economically powerful. They throw their weight around a lot more, and they can back it up. In the year 2000, autocratically ruled countries produced approximately 10% of global GDP. By 2024, they produced approximately 35%. So their economic power has risen. So how much does this matter? I feel like somebody who's worked in the democracy and human rights field for a long time, like I've been watching a slow motion train wreck, wanting to warn folks. And it's been very challenging to get folks to see this has real implications. And so what are some of those implications? How much does it matter to the United States if the world is becoming more autocratic? And this is where the studies that compare democratic and autocratic governments becomes really, really useful. The summary of the findings, I'll list some findings of those studies, but a summary is this. Democracies outperform autocracies on pretty much every single meaningful measure we can think of when it comes to governance. There's one exception I can talk about in the Q&A, but in general, on average, autocratic governments have worse gender equality than democracies. Autocratic governments have lower average economic growth. Autocrats mismanage their economies and are about 3 times more likely to have an economic crisis. Autocratic governments tend to majorly underinvest in infrastructure, roads, internet, they tend to invest less in infrastructure than democracies. What they majorly underinvest in is the social safety nets of their populations. Autocratic governments have worse public health outcomes than democracies. They have lower life expectancies and higher infant mortality rates on average. They're much worse at protecting labor rights. They tend to pay lower wages. They invest less in education. They have lower secondary school enrollment and lower student class times. They are, of course, massively more corrupt than democracies. Autocrats steal from taxpayers to reward their allies and stay in power. They have terrible human rights records. They are, on average, worse at responding to climate change. They're more likely to experience civil war. I'm almost done, I promise. And many of these above attributes that I just mentioned contribute to a growing number of refugees. And guess where those refugees are increasingly wanting to go? To democracies, which is also having a powerful and sometimes divisive effect on the politics within those democracies, which is not to blame those who want to move there. It is just to say the function that that has had is that it has created a political situation that has been tough for democracies to manage. And then there's the question of international conflict. Democracies, they go to war, but they almost never go to war against each other. Autocrats, on the other hand, will wage war proactively against democracies. When we think of the security challenges faced by Ukraine, and Europe, they come from Russia, but would a democratic Russia invade Ukraine and threaten Europe? No. When we think of the security challenges faced by Taiwan, they come from the People's Republic of China. Would that happen if the PRC government was a democracy? When we think of the security challenges faced by South Korea, you know what I'm going to say. Would it happen with a democratic North Korea? There are structural reasons why we're seeing more interstate warfare and more violent conflict. And one of those is the growing incidence of authoritarian governments around the world. I would argue for all the allies that I just mentioned, you really can't count them secure over the long term as long as they have autocratic governments with imperial ambitions right at their borders. It's a direct threat to peace and security. So given all, and then, okay, one more thing. I even wanted to move ahead. But we've got to remember something. It's obvious, but I'm just going to say it. Autocracy doesn't burn out by itself, and it doesn't solve itself. A defining characteristic of autocrats is they try to stay in power. They try to shift the electoral playing field. They try to corrupt the judiciary. They do what they can to make sure that they stay in power. And usually they have to be forced out. Usually they don't go willingly. And so while we see this and we think, okay, well, is this a pendulum that can swing back? Historically, we can look and say, actually, there is a pendulum that swings, but it doesn't swing automatically. It swings because we make it swing. Autocrats don't just leave. They find themselves eventually with no choices because people have worked hard to make sure that they have to leave. And so for me, like the level of value that democracy has around the world, I think has been underappreciated when we think about international affairs and think about what this means to the US. I think that democracy policy is security policy. I think we need to think of democracy policy as part of our security policy internationally. And so I also think that given that, democracy supports one of the best investments we can make in terms of our foreign policy. It is not a huge portion of the budget, has not been a huge portion of the budget, and yet the value that it can deliver is potentially huge. But to be honest with you, democracy support has not been it has not been a core interest of the United States foreign policy for quite some time. And I know that might sound sacrilegious and that might ruffle some feathers. I'm not saying the United States doesn't care about democracy or human rights. I'm not saying that the United States hasn't done good things. I know they have given good funding. I have supported a USAID program that I really believe in. I know great people who have worked in the State Department on democracy. I know really good programs and that have really tangible, concrete benefits of good US pro-democracy policy. Yet, when it comes time to make budget decisions, or when it comes time to think of foreign policy trade-offs, the top two usually are security cooperation and trade. And when those conflict with the democracy agenda usually is the one that gets cut. It's usually the one that doesn't really make it through to the end of the policy. The US has talked a lot about democracy. We lead with it rhetorically. I think the intent and heart and spirit is there, and we do it when we can. But when trade-offs have to be made, increasingly what I've seen is that democracy is the thing that gets traded, particularly when security cooperation and trade are considered the top priorities, as they so often are. Democracy support increasingly, in my view, in foreign policy, has less and less of a seat at the table. And this is not a new thing necessarily. This has been going on for a while. So I understand that all countries have competing interests, and there are times where trade and security cooperation are going to be our highest priorities. But if we sacrifice democracy every time it conflicts with these other interests, we are actually eroding the foundations of our long-term security internationally. And in the process, we may actually be marginalizing the other interests like trade and security that we are supposedly putting first. So what does a foreign policy that counters authoritarianism and supports democracy look like? We can draw some lessons from our own history on this. Before the current autocratic wave, there was something called the Third Democratic Wave. And it lasted from 1974 until approximately 2006, and it saw democracy spread around the globe massively. The Third Democratic Wave started slowly. It actually started at a time of great pessimism. It came when democracies were on their back foot. 1974, you had Richard Nixon and scandal in the White House. You had the war in Vietnam. You had the recent fall of the Allende government in Chile. You had dictatorship and martial law in the Philippines. You had Laos and Cambodia falling to communist rule. You had Henry Kissinger as US Secretary of State, not emphasizing democracy as the cornerstone of his foreign policy for sure. Remarking on the sentiment of the times, democracy scholar Larry Diamond stated, I love this quote, "In the mid-1970s, you had to be a crank or a romantic to believe that the bulk of the world's countries would become democratic over the next quarter century." Yet this is when the Third Democratic Wave started. It wasn't identified at the time. No one called it at the time. It's only when we look back and we say, my gosh, at that moment of deep pessimism was actually an inflection point. So starting in 1974, various governments began shifting towards democracy. Portugal, then Greece, then Spain. The pace of progress was initially slow. Overall gains were modest. From 1974 to 1982, the percentage of democracies in the world rose just a bit, from 30 to 34%. No one was feeling too triumphant, even 8 years into this democratic wave. They still were like, we're not sure which way this is going to go. Democracies probably are not going to continue to spread. But in the years following the democratic wave, much to people's surprise, actually picked up. In the 1986 People Power Revolution in the Philippines, a popular nonviolent movement ended the dictatorship of Ferdinand Marcos. That was followed by the democratic transition in South Korea, and then in Chile in 1988. And then the question arose, could this actually spread to the Soviet Union? Few, if any, predicted that it would. In fact, in 1988, the CIA issued guidance saying that they thought the Eastern European countries were stable and likely to continue. That was 1988. Yet 1989 marked the beginning of the end of Soviet rule. Poland, Czechoslovakia, the Baltic states, East Germany, and other states all transitioned over the following several years. The wave even affected Russia directly. When there were hardline elements that sought to roll back liberalization there in 1991, they were stopped by massive nonviolent defiance, which basically made a coup attempt fail. And then with the collapse of the Soviet Union, you had democracy spread to South Africa. You had Indonesia went through a democratic transition. And then you saw this extend into the 21st century. You saw Serbia, Georgia, Ukraine, Nepal, all have democratic breakthroughs. On balance, this third democratic wave continued through 2006, at which point 58% of countries with populations over 1 million were considered democratic. It really freaked autocrats out, by the way. You can see why they got their act together and said, let's roll this back. So if we want to foster a fourth democratic wave now, what can we learn from the third wave? So one thing that's notable is that the third wave coincided with a shift in US foreign policy. I find this really fascinating. In 1973, Minnesota Congressman Donald Fraser's subcommittee on international organizations and movements, I think that's the coolest subcommittee name I've ever heard. I would love to serve on that subcommittee. They held a series of 15 hearings on human rights and foreign policy. The subcommittee then issued a report in early 1974 finding that the United States should make human rights a major foreign policy goal. Imagine that, still very much in the heat of the Cold War, for a recommendation saying, elevate human rights as a foreign policy goal. In fact, one of your top ones. Over the following 5 years, the subcommittee held more than 500 hearings with 150 witnesses examining human rights records of numerous autocratic countries all over the world. Fraser's hearings led to the establishment of the State Department's Bureau of Human Rights and Humanitarian Affairs, which later became the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, which still exists today. The subcommittee's efforts also led to amendments to the U.S. Foreign Assistance Act, the Mutual Assistance Act, the Trade Reform Act, and later to the International Financial Institutions Act. The amendments all ended or reduced U.S. assistance, development or security assistance to countries that were gross violators of human rights, although the president retained the option to continue assistance if the president found a compelling reason to do so. So there was a little carve-out. Congress soon mandated that the State Department also soon produce human rights reports annually on countries that received U.S. aid. And then Congress also wanted to be in the driver's seat on sanctions, and they continued to assert themselves by sanctioning specific governments that violated human rights, regardless of what the president wanted to do. In 1975, as many of you know, President Gerald Ford signed the Helsinki Accords with 34 other countries, including the Soviet Union. The accords reiterated the recognition of human rights and became an umbrella under which pro-democracy dissidents began to organize under communism. Building on this, you have President Carter, who emphasized human rights, both in his 1976 election campaign. Can you imagine a candidate for president emphasizing a human rights foreign policy as a plank they're running on? You never know. In the grand scope of history, we may come to see it pass again. We'll see. And then he continued talking about it when he was president. He and his Secretary of State, Cyrus Vance, spoke frequently about human rights. They applied diplomatic pressure to dictatorships. They publicly recognized the courage of political dissidents abroad. The Carter administration suspended economic assistance to some governments that abused human rights. They reduced arms sales to Latin American military dictatorships, and they upgraded human rights within the State Department bureaucracy. And then we get to Ronald Reagan. Reagan immediately bucked this trend. He ran his election campaign against Carter's foreign policy. And in his first year of office, Ronald Reagan hosted dictators from South Korea and Argentina at the White House, and he notably, conspicuously failed to press them on human rights. Reagan's first Secretary of State was Alexander Haig, who in the opening press conference stated, his opening press conference as Secretary of State, he says, quote, "International terrorism will take the place of human rights as the top priority of the State Department." He didn't have to say that. He could have said, "We're deeply concerned about terrorism. It's a top issue." He chose to say, "It's the new number one." Reagan's initial nominee for the State Department's Bureau of Human Rights was Ernest Lefebvre. Lefebvre was a man who just a year prior had advocated for the abolition of the bureau he was nominated to lead. However, President Reagan apparently underestimated the strength, and bipartisan, I would add, the bipartisan strength of supporting human rights in Congress at this point, as Lefebvre was rejected by the Senate with a bipartisan majority of 13-4. We see this theme that it's not just the executive, Congress is asserting itself too here. And even President Reagan, in spite of his first year in office, where he was trying to send a clear signal, ultimately shifted significantly by 1982. There was increasing recognition that prioritizing human rights and democracy was good strategy, that it was in the national interest to do this. Reagan's UN ambassador stated in 1981 that, quote, Jeane Kirkpatrick, UN ambassador, stated, quote, "Not only should human rights play a central role in U.S. foreign policy, no U.S. foreign policy can succeed that does not accord them a major role." Why does she think that's strategic? What's the calculus there? Well, Kirkpatrick's statement reflects an emerging understanding that emphasizing human rights was actually essential to winning the Cold War. This was spelled out more clearly. This is a great declassified memo I'm going to quote from here. It was spelled out clearly in a 1981 memo, confidential memo, to Alexander Haig from some senior officials at the State Department. I'm going to read from it. They start, "Human rights, meaning political rights and civil liberties, gives us the best opportunity to convey what is ultimately at issue in our contest with the Soviet bloc. The fundamental difference between us is not in economic or social policy, but in our attitudes towards freedom." If I'm gonna, okay. End quote for a second. Let me editorialize that for a second. Do you hear that? The big debate was supposed to be between economic systems. They just said that's not actually what's going to help us win. The big difference between us is about governance. The fundamental difference between us is not in economic or social policy, but in our attitudes towards freedom. Our ability to resist the Soviets around the world depends in part on our ability to draw this distinction and persuade others from it. Who are the others? Populations around the world, which I'll come back to. What the people in countries around the world think matters. On the question of balancing competing national interests, they wrote, we have to be prepared to pay a price. In most specific cases taken alone, the need for good bilateral relations will seem to outweigh our broad concern for freedom and decency. Nevertheless, it is a major error to subordinate these considerations in each case, because taken together, these decisions will destroy our policy. If we act as if offenses against freedom don't matter in countries friendly to us, no one will take seriously our words about communist violations. And here's how they conclude. A human rights policy means trouble, for it means hard choices which may adversely affect certain bilateral relations. There's no escaping this without destroying the policy, for otherwise what would be left is simply coddling friends and criticizing foes. Despite the cost of such a real human rights policy, it is worth doing, and indeed it is essential. In the same year that this memo was written, President Reagan saw organized workers rise up nonviolently and go and engage in labor strikes in Poland, the Solidarity movement against Polish dictatorship. The following year, he saw a democratic election in El Salvador where people voted to reject armed insurgents who were boycotting those elections. They wanted democracy. They lined up for hours in El Salvador to vote. These events validated and began to sort of germinate in him somewhat of a view that populations and countries could be a powerful force driving democracy. And in that same year, his faith that dictators might be good allies was shaken. Argentina invaded the Falklands and started the Falklands War against the UK. Not exactly a reliable, predictable move there. And something that sort of made him start to question, perhaps autocrats are not the most reliable, stable partners after all. On June 8, 1982, President Reagan made his famous Westminster speech to the UK Parliament, in which he stated, from Stettin on the Baltic to Varna on the Black Sea, the regimes planted by totalitarianism have had more than 30 years to establish their legitimacy. But none, not one regime, has yet been able to risk free elections. Regimes planted by bayonets do not take root. I listened to it the other day. It's a really good speech. By 1983, Reagan had worked with Democratic Representative Dante Fascio of Florida to create the National Endowment for Democracy, which of course is funded by Congress and exists to this day. The U.S. Information Agency, which supported broadcasters like Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, was also boosted as a source of information to reach behind and through the censorship of dictators. Some U.S. diplomats started to become much more aggressive in their position of pushing democracy. And then Reagan actually pulled support from two U.S. allies when they were challenged by major nonviolent movements, Augusto Pinochet in Chile and Ferdinand Marcos in the Philippines. It was last minute, but there was a shift in U.S. policy there. So I could go on. I'm going to stop at 1982 because my point is not to retell a full history. It's to show a pivot. And in every account and analysis I've read of the third democratic wave, U.S. policy is credited as playing a constructive role. It did matter. Now, was U.S. foreign policy the main driver of the wave or the only driver of the wave? Of course not. For me, as somebody who looks at pro-democracy movements, the front of that was people actually nonviolently pushing back and mobilizing and demanding, exerting bottom-up pressure against dictatorships to say, we need to change this. And so there's enormous credit to them. But US policy mattered, and I'll talk a little bit more about how it complemented that. I should also say, though, because I don't want to oversimplify things, the US continued, even after this pivot that I'm talking about, to make some really bad foreign policy decisions. We didn't implement this perfectly. We didn't have every judgment call right. There were still times where the US was hypocritical, sometimes tragically so. And I don't want to gloss that over. This happened under the 70s and 80s under both Democratic and Republican administrations. Blunders were made, bad decisions continued to be made, and yet the overall arc had shifted towards emphasizing human rights and their strategic importance and starting to put votes in the UN, decisions on security cooperation, decisions on aid, sanctions into effect. And so, again, one thing that strikes me about this pivot is Congress was the one that initiated it. Congress asserted itself. They organized, they built legislation, they built the scaffold so that presidents, who may not have early on been convinced, could actually pursue this more aggressively. But the bigger point I want to make is also that underneath this shift and this pivot is the idea that populations around the world actually have power. Why do human rights matter? Why does political space for populations matter as a strategic interest? Because populations, if they have space, will use it. People don't like living in dictatorship most of the time. They don't want authoritarian government after they taste it for a while. And so when they have space to organize, it is very helpful to them. And I see in this policy the beginnings of a real understanding that foreign policy is not just from the top down. It's not just elite to elite negotiation. There's another player there called the population of the country. They don't have to be spectators. They're actually, what they think and do is centrally important. And I think this recognition is as relevant then as it is today. It should be a more central consideration in how we formulate and execute foreign policy. So I'm going to make one other point, a few more stats, sorry, and then I'll close. But when I say this about the importance of populations in constraining dictatorship, it's not just an idea. There's been a huge growth of research in this idea over the last 20 years, and it's found some really powerful findings that I want to share with you. So one was in a 2011 book called Why Civil Resistance Works, civil resistance being nonviolent sort of forms of confronting dictatorship, strikes, boycotts, protests. Why does it work? In it, scholars Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stephan evaluated over 300 violent and nonviolent campaigns seeking political transitions, generally trying to get out of dictatorship between 1900 and 2006. So a lot of cases over about a century. What they found was surprising to many analysts. Their research showed that nonviolent movements, many of whom were struggling against dictators, achieved their goals 53% of the time. The violent insurgencies achieved their goals only 26% of the time. In addition, they found that nonviolent movements challenged governments that were just as brutal and powerful as the ones faced by armed insurgencies. So you couldn't say that the armed insurgents took on tougher governments. They didn't. And yet the nonviolent movements continued to have a 2-to-1 success rate relative to the armed ones. Studies also find that political transitions driven by bottom-up pressure are more likely to lead to democracy. They tend to be more stable. They tend to consolidate. That is not always the case. We can think of some examples where that hasn't happened. Political transitions are really tough to navigate. But if you're looking at different ways that countries get out of dictatorship, one of the most promising is through bottom-up pressure, for sure. And there's still, I could go on. There's studies that show that transitions driven by nonviolent movements have increases in economic growth that are greater than the alternatives, that they tend to result in rebounds in a population's life expectancy. All of this is documented in peer-reviewed research at this point. So the findings are clear. Organized populations are a powerful force that can counter authoritarianism. They can drive democratic transitions. And what we saw in the third democratic wave is that when foreign policy aligns itself with this fact, it can be very powerful. So in closing, as we think about the threat of rising autocracy globally, we have a chance to pivot. We have a chance to pivot like we did in the late decades of the Cold War. To do this, a first order of business has to be restoring funding, staff, and government capacity that has recently been lost. As many of us are aware, democracy support has been cut back significantly over the last year, some of it under the premise of cost savings. To my mind, I would turn that claim on its head. We can't afford not to invest in democracy support, given the state of the world where it currently is. I think, as I said, they're some of the best investments we can make. And as we think about foreign policy, it's very important to think about elite to elite interaction and top down, but we need to increasingly think about bottom up. How can we create an enabling environment for populations to push back as well against autocracy and misrule? I could see signs, in spite of my earlier comments where I was critical of the United States for not emphasizing democracy enough. I could see signs in recent years that the State Department and USAID were actually starting to move in this direction again. The US still has a vital role to play here. The opportunity still exists. It's really for us to be prepared to take it. So thank you so much again, and I look forward to hearing your comments.
Hardy, appreciate that very much. Gave us much to think about. Now it's time for you to engage our presenter in some conversation. If you'd like to text your questions, 616-308-6560. And you know our house rules, succinct and respectful question, right? Okay, so I got one back here first.
Thank you for your wonderful presentation. Where do you see the U.S. on the democracy-autocracy spectrum, and what direction do you see us moving in?
Great. Should we take several and I can get to that one, or do you take them one at a time? What's best? Okay. Well, I won't hide it. I'm on the record as saying I think we've shifted net autocratically, and here's how I think about it. If we put democracy and autocracy on a scale where 0 is autocracy and 100 is democracy, at some point we reach the 50% point and cross it. Now, reasonable people can disagree about at what point a country reaches that point. As I said, the debates get heated, but I am on the record as saying that I do think we have crossed that point. I'm very concerned about the state of US democracy. And even if we have crossed that point, there's still a lot of democracy left in the US. There's still a lot to work with. There's still a lot of space. This is where simple labels break down. When you say autocracy, you think of some of the worst autocracies. We are not there. But have we shifted to a point where the way we talk, the way we think, the way we engage, the way institutions are working have shifted in an autocratic direction? I would argue yes. And it's just a question of, has it reached that threshold? I'm on the record of saying, yes, it has reached the threshold of crossing, but there are others who may not, and I think we can have reasonable conversations about that.
Given what you just said, how do we move the United States towards more democratic system?
How do we move the US towards a more democratic system?
What could we do?
I think that the findings that I quoted at the end are universal in the sense that what we know from looking at over a century of data is that organized and mobilized populations are one of the best protectors of democracy and one of the best bulwarks against authoritarianism. If you have rights, you have to use them. What we've seen increasingly is backsliding democracies and democracies breaking down globally. One of the things that characterizes those particular circumstances is a sense of confusion that people have. It feels overwhelming. Wait a minute, we have these institutions, I still see them, and yeah, we have, but they seem to be not working as well. And things are happening in a way and at a pace that I didn't anticipate. And that can feel enormously disorienting. Are we just one election cycle away from something shifting, or is something deeper, really need to be addressed? So confusion is a common state when democracy is backsliding. What we know works is an alignment of mobilization, using your rights nonviolently, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, protests, and so forth, freedom of association, and doing your best to align those with institutional pressures that can constrain and push back on an autocracy, and it's sort of an autocratizing political system. Institutions alone usually aren't enough. You really do need people pushing back. Yeah.
Hi, thank you. Over here.
Mm-hmm. Hey.
My question is kind of a follow-up to that one, but I'm going to change it a little bit so you can answer it without repeating yourself. Could you give us an example from history maybe, or or an imagined future where nonviolent creative resistance has ousted a full-on autocrat? And if so, how would that happen?
Sure. So there are a number of examples. I talked about the Philippines and Chile, so I'll pick a different one. I will focus on Serbia under Slobodan Milosevic. So Milosevic, for those of you who remember, when he was front page news a lot, was known as the Butcher of the Balkans. He launched multiple wars. He was in power for a little over a decade in Serbia, ultimately ousted in 2000. He also managed to crash the economy in true autocratic fashion, all the while claiming to be the savior of the country, go figure. And so there were several different waves of protest against Milosevic. The first was in the early 1990s. It was predominantly protest. It was not effective in actually stopping him. He continued. In 1996, he tried to subvert municipal elections and steal them, which led to a lot of protracted mobilization, and ultimately people were able to enforce those election results at the local level, which was really important because now they could control certain cities from they had mayorships and city council members, but even more important was the fact that they had the experience of pushing back and winning. And so when the 2000 election came, people were very ready for what Milosevic was going to try. They knew he was going to try to stuff ballots, steal the election, and so they organized. They organized significantly. They organized hard to, number one, get the opposition parties, of which there were many, because Serbia is a multi-party democracy, to unify under one banner called the Democratic Opposition of Serbia. This is harder than you think. You think it's hard having two parties. Try uniting 12 that don't like each other and all have their own little piece of the pie and all have their own ambitions to get them to agree on one candidate. That unity that happened was actually a result of grassroots pressure. It was not a bunch of enlightened politicians getting together and saying, you know what, let's unify. It was the grassroots saying, we need a unity candidate. We are going to reward whoever's willing to check their ego, actually. The best thing for your ego right now in the long term would be to check it now and get behind someone. That's the game we're playing. And then when the election came, they were ready to defend the results. When it was clear that Milosevic was trying to subvert the election, miners in the largest coal mine, which really powered Serbia, a lot of electricity came from the coal in that mine, went on strike. When Milosevic said, well, we don't really know the outcome of the election, even though there was a parallel vote count clearly showing the opposition won, people increasingly started coming to Belgrade and demonstrating. Over the course of a week, there was a buildup. Ultimately, what happened with Milosevic was that his own security forces even defected on him. They were not going to turn on the people. There is an element of what I just said in what we saw in Ukraine in 2004, in what we saw in Philippines in 1986, and what we saw in Chile in 1988, that when enough people push back, and they do so nonviolently, and they do so with unity, that actually most of the time, those who have been enabling or loyal or in some way part of the autocratic system say, we are not signed up for this. We are not going along with it anymore. And at that point, autocrats ultimately have no choices. They are forced out.
Thank you for being here. In light of the disinvestment that we've had in this country in democracy and human rights policymaking, how much do you think we're currently relying on the European Union to help pivot to this fourth wave, and how well equipped or not is the EU to help that process?
That's a great question. So USAID delivered about $2 billion of democracy support funding. That's not much, but it was a huge amount globally. As a proportion of overall support, it was huge. It kept the lights on, it kept dissidents supported, it kept organizations going, it kept news going. I mean, it kept reporting from inside countries. So it funded a lot. They stretched that money. The Bureau of Democracy, Rights and Labor funded about $345 million in grants. National Endowment for Democracy, which still exists, funded a little over $300 million that was their budget. And so when a lot of that came offline, it's a hole that's too big to fill. European governments are not prepared to fill that hole. Private philanthropy is not prepared to fill that hole. And the hole is both the funding, but also just the sheer lack now of expertise that's had to go looking elsewhere for jobs. I mean, so many of my friends at USAID lost their jobs mid-career with no network to even know how to network into a new field, and not even sure if they interviewed, given their high level of competency, that an interviewer, an employer would understand their skills and how they transferred. And so it is recoverable. It will take time, money, and political will. I think Europe has moved more and more towards a defensive posture. Traditionally, it's been the Scandinavian countries that have been the heaviest, sort of the heaviest contributors, especially considering their population size, to democracy support. Denmark, Norway, Sweden have been huge. To some extent, Finland. UK has done some, but they can't fill that hole. And even their governments now are coming under increasing pressure to be less focused on that and more focused on other priorities. I think the thing is that it's going to take time to turn this around, even if we start really making the effort to. You know, one thing I hope is not lost is that just as the third autocratic wave started slowly, so too did the third democratic wave. It takes commitment. You're going to have to do the right thing for a while before you see the results. I think we can get back there. But we have to make the commitment too.
Over here, yeah. Thank you for your comments. I'm interested in your view on the Arab Spring, because it seems like that was a potential another democratic wave that really didn't deliver, and in fact delivered worse outcomes for many.
Yep. So I think a few things on that. I mean, there's a lot we could say. One is to look at like, okay, so waves are both a thing that happens to groups of countries, but they don't negate the individual attributes of each country, right? So we can look at them like one country at a time, but we can also think of them as a wave. And what was the first country in that wave was Tunisia, which successfully got rid of a 23-year autocrat, President Ben Ali, and had a pretty good run before democracy was subverted again. It is enormously hard to stick the landing when you get out of dictatorship. It is very hard. Institutions have to be rebuilt, norms have to be reestablished, people have to start believing and agreeing with the trust in the game, judiciary needs to be independent. It's really challenging. But it's also, I can't say, well, you know, the fact that Tunisia backslid approximately 10 years after their transition means the transition failed. There's lots of other intervening factors in 10 years that could lead to that outcome. In Egypt, more than I can say. It's tragic. It's absolutely tragic. I think one thing we see is that in spite of how challenging dictators are, when they just suddenly resign the way Mubarak did, it makes the transition even tougher to manage. The best way out of a dictatorship, if you can handle it, is still an election like the one in Serbia where the results are reinforced. In an election scenario, there's a mandate for the people who won the election to take over. In a messy resignation like Mubarak, the day after, there's still no mandate to take over, and that leaves the regime in a driver's seat. The other thing is that just as a wave progresses and activists and organizers get inspiration and try to emulate each other, autocrats learn too. I think by the time the wave reached Bahrain or Syria, for example, the softliners, if any existed in those governments, were pretty well marginalized. Oh, you want to go soft? Look at what just happened to Ben Ali. Look at what just happened to Mubarak. And so autocrats learn too. They have learned. They are extraordinarily afraid of popular mobilization pushing back, and they do their best to foil it. They will help each other, big time. And I don't just mean diplomatically. I mean, when there was a movement in Sudan pushing against government there were emergency loans made to Sudan by other autocrats when the Sudanese government was facing a general strike. In Belarus in, I think it was 2022, when state-run media started walking off the job because they didn't want to report this fake news anymore, Russia sent journalists to Belarus to keep that fake news going. They really are deeply invested in this. And this goes back a little bit to the Europe question. Democracies around the world need to play as a team. And we are not playing as a team and have not played as a team to the extent that we've needed to in the last decade or two. If you want sanctions to be effective, for example, you have to be aligned with your other democracies. If you're not, what good is it if the US just sanctions one country and European countries don't? How much does that really hurt them? And the other thing is that autocrats will increasingly threaten democracies economically. We've seen China try to bully everything from Lithuania to Australia. There needs to be some equivalent of like an economic NATO, Article 5 collective defense. If autocrats are trying to economically bully other countries, democracy should come to their aid, especially if those countries being bullied are democracies. I know these things sound distant. They were things that were discussed about even a few years ago. And so I think that we are not going to win, as good as our policy may become, assuming we get there, by ourselves. It will have to be a coalitional effort with other democracies. But it will also have to include populations.
Do these trends, democratic and autocratic, arise and gather momentum on their own, or do they follow in the wake of other trends? I noticed that the third democratic wave that you described seemed to parallel to the growth of globalization of trade, and that the growth of the autocratic wave that we're experiencing now, started about the time that the internet began to become ubiquitous.
Yeah.
Coincidence?
Well, I mean, thank you. There are plenty of structural factors we could point at that I think have contributed. Certainly the way the internet has evolved has come to favor autocrats. That has been obviously a complete 180 from the way people thought about the internet 25 years ago. Different waves are different. In the second autocratic wave started in about 1926 after you had the end of World War I, and then you started, and yes, that correlated with a lot of radical movements on the left and right that overthrew democratic governments. That was part of that autocratic wave. After World War II, you had a democratic wave. Why? Because the democracies won. And democratic armies had performed well in the battlefield. Democracy had this sort of more hegemonic ascendancy, and the US invested heavily in the Marshall Plan. And that lasted till about 1962, and then you had the second autocratic wave, which was marked by a lot of coups, Cold War-style coups just trying to overthrow governments for 12 years. Now, why did the third democratic wave start in 1974? I can't say. I do think that autocracy starts to wear out its welcome after a while. I don't know how many of you were watching the Hungarian election. Viktor Orban, you know who he is? Yeah. So I haven't watched it closely, but the recent polling shows him far underwater. Eventually people tire. Eventually people tire. Now that's not enough. Public opinion itself won't constrain autocrats. People being sick of autocrats won't constrain autocrats. But people being sick and mobilized is something autocrats really, really don't want, which is why they all try to help each other when it happens. So that is sort of the active ingredient there. Dissatisfaction, but then people increasingly saying, we're gonna push back, you're not as strong as you say you are. And actually, if we start to shift our buying patterns, our labor patterns, the ways in which we work, if we start to build sort of cross-sector alliances, faith communities, labor communities, veterans associations, and others, if we stick together, we can win. And that is sort of what you try to inculcate when you work with opposition groups around the world, that this is actually winnable, that you're in a contest. In a contest, unity, strategy, discipline really matter. Yeah.
We do have some more audience questions, but I want to ask a few questions that came in via text, one of which is kind of following up on this. An audience member wanted you to contrast recent history of Poland and Hungary and why Poland has been able to, become democratic, and of course what we're seeing in Hungary is not. And then a second question is about refugees and U.S. cutting refugee admissions from 125,000 in 2025 to 7,500 in 2026, particularly regarding refugees coming from autocratic countries and concerning any concerns about democratic backsliding.
So I know more about Poland than Hungary. So if I compare them, I'm not going to do Hungary justice. So let me start by talking about Poland, because in both countries, they pushed back, the population pushed back hard against authoritarianism. But I'll talk a little bit about why I saw Poles be successful. Poles have a lived experience of resistance to authoritarianism, very active resistance to authoritarianism in the form of the Solidarity Movement, which was from about 1980 to 89. Solidarity Movement was, as its name implied, about solidarity. It was led by a labor union called Solidarity, but there was lots of cross-class solidarity in that movement. Previously in Poland, in the 70s, you'd have workers rise up and sort of the more white-collar folks would stay home, and then you'd have the white-collar folks rise up, and then the workers would stay home, and finally they're like, we gotta fight this together. And so Poles have a real rich resistance in the 1980s of pushing back actually successfully against authoritarianism. They even survived martial law and kept fighting. And so when the Law and Justice Party came into power in Poland in 2015, a few things. That confusion that I talked about earlier about democratic backsliding, when you have authoritarianism in your lived experience, you're not confused very much. It's a different thing. Poles knew what authoritarianism felt like, looked like, what it talked like, how it sounded, where it goes, the logic of it. And so they moved into action quickly. You could say, arguably, the fact that they had not been a democracy for a long time meant that memory was fresh in living people who remembered that, and they drew on that. They had in Solidarity something called the Committee for the Defense of Workers, which was basically like communities able to come together and provide for workers' families and so forth. They actually readopted those same structures against Law and Justice Party when they started backsliding Poland in 2015. Polish judges, this is an amazing story. Polish judges were getting picked off. The way Law and Justice wanted to break Polish democracy was by attacking the judiciary. They did like a blitz. Force judges into retirement, strip them of immunity, prosecute them, appoint crony judges, just like destroy the judiciary as fast as possible. And Polish judges realized something. They realized that if they stayed with their socialization, and their socialization, like any proper judge in a democracy, is to stay far from politics, to let your opinions speak for yourself. Don't go out there and try to be the front of anything. Your opinions will speak. Be above sort of civil society, not in civil society. And what Polish judges realized as they were getting plucked out and threatened with prosecution is that if we don't become part of civil society, we're sitting ducks. We're going to get picked off one at a time. So they said we need to become people's judges. We need to start going to communities around Poland. Yes, cities, but actually a lot of small towns. And yeah, let's hit rock concerts too. They literally went to rock concerts, judges did. And talk to people. Here's what we do. Here's why it's important. Here's how it matters to you. Here's what's happening. Yeah, you've probably never met a judge. This is who we are. We're just like you. We are people. We are Poles. We are citizens first. And this is what's happening, and this is why it matters. If you get into trouble, do you want a crony judge, or do you want a judge who's actually committed to a fair trial for you? And they built that, and it worked. They even protested. There was a protest called the March of 1,000 Robes that they did, where they literally, Polish judges in their robes, marched to call attention to the fact that they were being attacked. They held pockets of the Constitution, like pocket constitutions, and waved them. And when judges were being persecuted, they would raise money for them. They'd do like solidarity actions. They'd all wear shirts that says Konstytucja, which means Constitution, and organize together to support judges being persecuted. When crony judges were appointed in Poland, sitting judges who were part of the old government basically socially ostracized them. They wouldn't attend their swearing-in ceremonies, and they wouldn't socialize with them except anything beyond exactly what was required for the job. They really used their tools to exert pressure, and that was just one front. And so if you look at sort of democracy in Poland, was pretty stable, and then it went for a dive. But if you look at it as a graph, but it caught itself, and now it's on the way back up. It was a result of organizing, but organizing that was in alignment with institutions, because together that's what it takes.
Welcome to Grand Rapids, great job. This is my question. What are you seeing when you visit the universities, the Ivy Leagues? What we're seeing now in junior high and high school, that nothing is on the curriculum that's mandatory for the history of the United States. And what can we do to help you so that, particularly, say, the Ivy Leagues, that they think that, they just want to work for, Jamie Dimon or do the artificial intelligence, is to try to get back to that they know the story. And I mean, as grandparents, et cetera, what can we do locally with these school systems to bring back history? So I don't know if you have a comment on that or not.
Well, I think it's time for a critical look at U.S. democracy and how it's actually performed for a lot of people. And I think, here's what I'd say. So Pew Research has a poll, a survey that goes all the way back to the 1960s. And it asks this question: what percentage of Americans, do you feel that the government in Washington will do the right thing most of the time or almost all the time? You know what the answer was in the 1960s? It was above 70%. After the financial crisis of 2009, it fell down to about 20% and never recovered. It's been down for about 16 years. And we've had Democratic and Republican administrations, and it has not moved much. And so my read is that a lot of people have lost confidence in US democracy. It hasn't worked for them, particularly when you look at wealth inequality. It's been very challenging for folks. And whether it's fair or not, plenty of folks have dropped out. Plenty of folks have decided politics is not where things are happening. Politics is where there's constant gridlock. I'm not interested. Some have said, you know what, this system's broken. I'm going to support a candidate that wants to reform everything or change everything or break it down. Others say, no, let's try to use the system. But we have to admit, the system, people have lost faith in it. As an international analyst, if you showed me a country with high levels of wealth inequality, and then you said to me, for 16 years, 20% of the people have had confidence in that government, I would say that's a government, it's just a matter of time before the democracy breaks down there. Because if people don't feel that the system's working for them and that they're stakeholders in it, they lose interest. And so I don't know what the best way is to teach people in this point, because I think the underlying lack of interest to some extent comes from a sense that they're learning about something that they don't have confidence is going to work. They've been told a set of things, but they haven't seen it. And I think more broadly, when we think about what makes democracy strong, it is not just a set of institutions. It's not just a set of structures. It's a system ultimately that people believe in. So if you think democracy is backsliding and you think that very few people have confidence in that democracy, you're not in the safe zone again until actually more people believe in that democracy, which is a longer term process. One other thing on that, though, is that in the United States, we tend to learn about democracy as we've got the best. It may not be true. Why are we convinced we have the best? Maybe we had the best at one point, maybe we need to reform it. Is that painful to say? Plenty of other countries do democracy differently. It's very interesting. They have multi-party democracy. At one point they had electoral colleges, now they don't. Their Supreme Court justices don't have lifetime appointments. They reformed their upper houses of parliament so that they weren't as powerful. They have all kinds of innovations. They have a different relationship with money and politics than we do. There are ways to do democracy that are really interesting, and we should become curious about the ways that other countries do it. I'm not saying they do it better, but I'm saying, shouldn't we be interested to look? When the public opinion polls speak for themselves, most people are not satisfied with the system right now. And so if I could wave my wand about how democracy was taught in schools, it would be comparative. I want students doing something where, sure, let's have you be in a decision-making process where you have a Congress, a Senate, and a president. Let's see what happens in a simulation. But then you're going to try a different simulation process where we're going to do multi-party proportional representation. Let's see what outcome you get. Let students experiment with the different ways this can go so they can develop their own sort of relationship and opinions about it.
Let's thank Hardy Merriman for giving us a lot to think about.